I had spent weeks planning this trip, every detail carefully mapped out, every dollar accounted for. My name is Alex, and when I decided to make this Super Bowl weekend a memory for my parents and myself, I poured everything I had into it, my savings, my time, my energy. I imagined us together, cheering in the stands, sharing laughs, photos, the kind of weekend that would bond us forever. I had visions of their excitement when they saw the tickets, their hugs when we landed, and the stories we would tell afterward. I thought it would be one of those rare moments where family felt complete. But the moment they spoke, it all shattered. "There's no space for you this weekend," my father said, almost casually, as if he were mentioning the weather. My mother nodded, her smile tight, unreadable. I froze. The tickets were already booked in my name. I had spent $15,000 on flights, accommodations, and tickets, everything, and they had just told me I wasn't invited. I could feel the disbelief running through me like electricity, my stomach knotting as I tried to process what I was hearing. All those late nights working extra shifts, skipping small luxuries, balancing bills just to make this happen. It felt meaningless in that instant. I had imagined their joy, their gratitude, even a little teasing or playful banter about the cost. Instead, I was met with a wall of indifference. I wanted to speak, to ask why, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, a quiet storm threatening to spill over, but I also felt a deep, heavy hurt. The people I had sacrificed for, the people I wanted to honor, were dismissing me in the most blatant way possible. I tried to reason, to tell myself there must be some mistake. Maybe they didn't understand, maybe they thought I would handle something else. But no. They were firm, and I could see it in their eyes. They weren't apologetic. They weren't hesitant. They were simply excluding me. My mind raced through every scenario, every possible explanation, trying to find a way to reconcile the love I had for them with the sting of their rejection. I could feel my chest tighten, my hands shake, but deep down I knew I had to make a choice. Would I let this humiliation define me, or would I find a way to reclaim control? Could I let them treat me as invisible after I had given so much, or was it time to stand up, not just for myself, but to ensure they understood the consequences of their words and actions? Every moment I had planned, every dollar I had spent, every ounce of energy I had put into making this trip perfect suddenly hung in the air, meaningless unless I acted. The stakes were clear: my self-respect, the respect my parents owed me, and the integrity of the family bond we had built over decades. Could I allow them to ignore my presence, my effort, my sacrifices, without consequence? Or would this be the moment I learned that love without acknowledgement can quickly turn into pain? I felt the dilemma pressing against me, a mixture of grief, anger, and determination all at once. If you've ever sacrificed for the people you love, only to feel invisible in return, then you know the hollow ache of being unacknowledged, the silent storm that brews when generosity meets disregard. And that is where I stood, holding my phone with the confirmation emails in hand, staring at my parents with disbelief, knowing that what I did next would not just define this weekend, it would define the way I allowed myself to be treated ever again. Subscribe now if you've ever been left out by the people who should have included you. From the moment the Super Bowl dates were announced, I couldn't stop thinking about how incredible it would be to go with my parents. My name is Alex, and I had always believed that experiences, memories, and shared moments could create bonds stronger than any gift or gesture. I imagined us walking through the stadium together, the roar of the crowd washing over us, cheering for every touchdown, laughing at the ridiculous commercials, and capturing photos we could look back on for years. This wasn't just a game, it was a chance to create a memory that would cement the closeness I had always wished for with my parents. I started planning months in advance. I researched flights obsessively, comparing airlines, checking seat availability, noting cancellation policies, and finding ways to maximize comfort without breaking the bank. I scoured hotel reviews, looking for places that were both convenient to the stadium and comfortable enough to feel like a mini retreat. I mapped out transportation options, parking logistics, shuttle services, and the timing of arrival for tailgating events. Every detail mattered because I wanted this trip to be perfect, not just for me, but for the people I had always put first. I wanted them to feel pampered, cared for, and appreciated, and I wanted to feel the pride of being the one who made it all possible. Even in the quiet moments, When no one else was thinking about the logistics, I found myself daydreaming. I imagined my dad's wide grin as he held his ticket, my mom's eyes sparkling with excitement as she tried to memorize the stadium map, the three of us taking silly selfies in team jerseys. I pictured us talking about old times, reminiscing over past family events, and creating inside jokes that no one else would understand. I wanted it to be a weekend that felt like our own little universe, a bubble where we could leave the world behind and just exist as family. Booking the flights was an emotional milestone. Every click of the keyboard, every transaction confirmation, filled me with a mix of exhilaration and pride. I was aware of the financial sacrifice I was making, but I didn't care. I had saved diligently, skipped indulgences, and worked extra hours to ensure that I could afford the best seats, comfortable accommodations, and a seamless experience. The money wasn't just numbers on a screen, it was a manifestation of my love, my dedication, and my vision for a moment that would mean everything. I had calculated, double-checked, and triple-checked every expense, wanting to leave nothing to chance. To me, this wasn't just a trip. It was a culmination of everything I had done to provide joy and connection for my parents. I also started thinking about the little touches that would make the weekend extraordinary. Personalized itineraries, hand-picked snacks for the hotel room, team-themed memorabilia, and even a few surprises I hoped would make them laugh. I wanted to show them that I had thought about every moment of the trip, that I had put my heart into planning an experience they would never forget. Each checklist item ticked off felt like a victory, a step closer to the joy I envisioned for us. Even while I planned, I told myself to stay flexible. Family trips are notorious for unexpected hiccups, and I didn't want my excitement to be dampened by small setbacks. Yet, there was a quiet thrill in imagining the reaction on their faces when they realized how much effort had gone into this weekend. I imagined the conversations, the laughter, the pride I would feel as I watched them enjoy what I had orchestrated. The anticipation was intoxicating. But amid all the excitement, there was a whisper of unease I tried to ignore. A fleeting thought that perhaps I was assuming too much, that they might not appreciate or even fully recognize my effort. I quickly brushed it aside, telling myself that love and effort were self-rewarding. I had always been the one who gave without needing recognition, and this time would be no different. My happiness was wrapped up in their joy, and I believed that would be enough. The more I planned, the more real it felt. Every itinerary drafted, every hotel confirmed, every ticket in hand made the weekend tangible. I started imagining the narrative of our adventure. The check-in, the tailgate, the stadium excitement, and the quiet moments of connection between the chaos. I envisioned late-night talks about the highs and lows of the season, reminiscing about games we had watched together on the couch, and making new memories to replace the ones that had faded. It felt monumental, and I carried that excitement with me everywhere I went. And yet, for all the preparation, all the meticulous planning, there was an underlying current of hope that maybe, just maybe, this trip would bridge the gaps I sometimes felt with my parents. I wanted them to see me not just as their child, but as the orchestrator of moments that mattered. I wanted the love and dedication I poured into this trip to be recognized, to be celebrated, even in small gestures, a thank you, a smile, a shared laugh. As the day of departure approached, the mix of emotions intensified. Excitement, anticipation, pride, and an undercurrent of vulnerability all swirled within me. This trip was more than a getaway. It was a testament to what I was willing to do for family, the lengths I would go to create joy, and the hope that my effort would be acknowledged, if only in fleeting moments of gratitude. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of planning was an investment in memory, in connection, in love. And so, I ask you now, have you ever invested in a family experience only to feel ignored? Have you ever poured your heart into creating joy for the people you love, only to wonder if your efforts matter at all? Because that was where I was, weeks of planning, dollars spent, countless hours dedicated, and all I wanted in return was acknowledgement, presence, and the warmth of family enjoying something I had built for us. Little did I know, the reality awaiting me would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and being seen by the ones I cared for most. Booking the flights and tickets was a process that demanded every ounce of patience and attention I had. I remember sitting at my desk late one night, my laptop screen glowing in the dim room, scrolling through airline options, comparing prices, and reading reviews of different seating arrangements. I had meticulously saved for months, putting aside funds I could have used for personal errands, experiences, or even small indulgences, all to make sure this trip for my parents would be flawless. Every dollar felt like a testament to my love and commitment, and I treated the process with the seriousness of someone building a legacy. I adjusted my personal plans, rearranging shifts at work to free up time for research and calls to airlines and travel agents. I sacrificed weekends and evenings that I would have normally spent relaxing, catching up on errands, or meeting friends. Instead, I focused on crafting the perfect itinerary, flight times that minimized layovers, tickets that would get them the best views in the stadium, and accommodations that offered convenience and comfort. I wanted to cover every detail, to anticipate every need, because I wanted them to feel cared for in ways they might not even realize. Once the tickets were finally booked, I felt a small, private rush of pride. Seeing the confirmation emails in my inbox, knowing that I had made their dream weekend possible, brought a sense of satisfaction that only someone who has given so much can understand. I pictured them opening the emails, their eyes lighting up, the excitement building, and I allowed myself a moment of happiness. For me, this was about more than a trip. It was about creating a memory, showing love through action, and investing in a shared experience that I hoped would bring us closer. But even in these early moments of excitement, subtle hints of exclusion began to surface. My parents expressed casual gratitude when I shared the details, a smile here, a polite thank you there, but there was a noticeable absence of the enthusiasm I had expected. Occasionally, comments would slip through that hinted at plans they might have been considering without including me, remarks about friends they wanted to take along or side trips that seemed independent of the main itinerary. At first, I brushed these aside, thinking I was overanalyzing or being sensitive. After all, planning and anticipation could make anyone jittery, and I wanted to trust that they were just excited in their own way. Despite the faint unease, I continued with the preparations, determined not to let small, ambiguous hints of exclusion derail what I had worked so hard to accomplish. I double-checked every confirmation, ensuring that nothing could go wrong, and I even created a detailed guide of the weekend, complete with maps, suggested activities, and tips for navigating the city. Every step I took was motivated by love and a desire to create a seamless experience. The thought of seeing their smiles and feeling their appreciation made the sacrifices feel worthwhile. Even as I focused on these tangible tasks, I also found myself navigating the emotional labor that came with this effort. Every conversation about the trip, every decision about seating or transportation, required careful wording to avoid tension or offense. I had learned through years of family dynamics that enthusiasm alone could not smooth over small disagreements or misunderstandings. I wanted my parents to feel cared for, but I also wanted to protect my own sense of dignity and ensure that the effort I poured into this trip was respected. Throughout this process, I began to notice the tiny ways my presence and contributions were minimized. A suggestion I made about accommodations would be met with a polite nod but no discussion, or my careful calculations for flight times would be casually overridden. I reminded myself repeatedly that the goal was not recognition but the success of the trip, yet I could not entirely ignore the sting of feeling overlooked. These moments, small as they were, began to chip away at the initial pride I had felt, leaving behind a simmering awareness that my effort might not be fully appreciated. I also had to contend with the logistical challenges that came with coordinating multiple moving parts. Airlines required confirmations, hotels needed deposits, and seating arrangements had to be verified. Each phone call or email carried the potential for stress or error, and I carried the weight of responsibility with me at all times. Yet, every obstacle I overcame, every problem I solved, reinforced my belief in the importance of this trip and the lengths I was willing to go for my parents' happiness. At times, I caught myself daydreaming about how the weekend would unfold. I pictured us arriving at the stadium together, feeling the buzz of anticipation around us, and exchanging excited glances as the first play of the game unfolded. I imagined post-game celebrations, dinners filled with laughter, and quiet moments where I could see the gratitude and joy on their faces. These visions kept me motivated, even when subtle hints of exclusion threatened to dampen my enthusiasm. And yet, despite the joy and anticipation, the small signs of disregard made me question how much my parents truly valued the effort I was investing. Casual comments about going with friends, playful suggestions that they might travel differently, and an occasional lack of acknowledgement all left me teetering between hope and doubt. I had committed so much time, energy, finances to this trip that the idea of being overlooked felt like a betrayal of my dedication. I wrestled with whether to voice my concerns or continue silently, hoping that the weekend itself would reflect the love and effort I had poured into every detail. By the time the weekend approached, I had invested more than money. I had invested emotional energy, anticipation, and a piece of my own sense of self-worth. Every decision, every call, every plan was a labor of love, and I clung to the belief that it would all be worthwhile. But the quiet tension in my parents' words and actions lingered in the background, a subtle reminder that even the best intentions could be met with indifference or misunderstanding. So I ask you now, would you keep giving even if your effort isn't fully appreciated? Would you continue to pour yourself into something or someone you love, knowing that recognition might never come? For me, that was the question that hovered over every flight confirmation, every hotel booking, and every meticulously planned itinerary. The anticipation of family joy was strong, but the faint whispers of exclusion had begun to form an unspoken challenge, one I was not yet ready to confront. I started noticing the subtle hints long before the trip. At first, they were easy to dismiss. My parents, with their usual cheerful banter, would mention friends they might want to bring along, casually drop ideas about side excursions, or speak in passing about how much they were looking forward to our little getaway, but the emphasis sometimes felt off. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was natural for people to talk excitedly about possibilities, and that none of it was meant to exclude me. I wanted to believe their words, because trusting them felt easier than worrying about being left out. One evening, while we were reviewing the final details for flights and accommodations, my father casually mentioned, "We might bring a friend to the game if you're busy, Alex. Just in case." He laughed lightly, as if it were a joke, but the words lingered. I forced a smile and nodded, assuring him that I would be there. Inside, a small voice whispered that maybe he wasn't taking my presence for granted in the way I had assumed. I shoved the thought aside. Why dwell on something that could just be a harmless suggestion? I had invested so much, and I refused to let fleeting unease overshadow my excitement. Later, during another conversation, my mother chimed in about how fun it would be to explore the city with old friends while attending the game. "Maybe we'll have a little side trip, just the three of us," she said, glancing at my father with a smile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the three of us wasn't the way they actually envisioned it. I didn't voice my worry. Instead, I nodded, adding a comment about what sights they should see or restaurants they should try. I reminded myself that overthinking might turn a joyful trip into something tense, and I didn't want that. I wanted to preserve family harmony, to trust their intentions, and to focus on the excitement that had carried me through months of planning and financial sacrifice. Even as I immersed myself in preparations, the unease grew quietly, like a shadow at the edge of my awareness. My parents would laugh about attending pre-game events or visiting landmarks with friends they hadn't mentioned before, always phrasing it as casual conversation. Each time, I reminded myself that they were just sharing ideas, that perhaps I was reading too much into it. I told myself, repeatedly, that family love should be based on trust, not suspicion, and that my role was to support and encourage. Still, the nagging questions persisted. Were they serious? Was I truly included in their plans? Was my effort and presence genuinely valued? I tried to counter my doubts with active involvement. I suggested restaurants, recommended convenient transportation, and made sure all tickets and reservations were meticulously organized. I kept a detailed spreadsheet of the itinerary, noting times, addresses, and confirmation numbers. Each effort was meant to reinforce my investment, to signal that I was engaged and committed. But even in my diligence, the subtle hints of exclusion remained. A casual remark here, a sidelong glance there, jokes about maybe you'll have other plans that felt oddly pointed. The tension became internalized. I found myself questioning how much I should assert, how much I should remain silent. I wanted to trust their words because maintaining peace in the family had always been important to me. Yet, my gut told me that some boundary had been crossed, that the polite reassurances were not enough to quell the anxiety forming in my chest. I began replaying conversations, reading between lines, and weighing the cumulative effect of what felt like little exclusions. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more conflicted I became. How could love coexist with actions that made me feel invisible? One night, I sat alone in my apartment, reviewing the itinerary once more, and the thought struck me sharply. What if the hints were not harmless? What if they were indicators of an entirely different plan, one where my presence was no longer considered essential? I quickly dismissed it. Surely they wouldn't go out of their way to exclude me. I had done everything, sacrificed so much, and even gone above and beyond to make this weekend possible. The very idea that my dedication could be overlooked seemed absurd. Yet, a knot of unease twisted tighter in my stomach, refusing to be ignored. Even my conversations with friends reflected my internal conflict. When I mentioned these casual remarks in passing, I received reassurances. They wouldn't do that to you, Alex. You've gone so far for them. They'll be grateful. But the rational advice did little to ease the pit in my stomach. I had to decide whether to trust my gut or continue believing in the polite reassurances that felt increasingly hollow. I wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, to focus on shared joy rather than imagined betrayals. Still, the subtle hints persisted like small, silent alarms. In the final days before the trip, I noticed a shift in their tone when speaking about friends and additional plans. They joked about maybe we'll have extra company and you'll understand when you see it. I asked clarifying questions, seeking to confirm that I would be included, and was met with vague assurances and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Each reassurance left me with an uneasy aftertaste, a persistent worry that no amount of planning or generosity could resolve. I found myself torn between wanting to trust them completely and listening to the quiet, insistent voice of intuition. Through it all, I remained committed to the trip. I refined the itinerary, checked tickets repeatedly, and coordinated logistics as though everything were perfectly normal. I told myself that any worry would be a distraction, that my focus should remain on the family experience I had envisioned. And yet, every casual comment about side plans or friends, every fleeting implication that I might not be central to their plans, chipped away at my certainty. It was a conflict between hope and suspicion, between loyalty and self-preservation, between love and the silent awareness that my sacrifices might not be fully valued. So I ask you, now that I am looking back, when do you trust your gut over polite reassurances? How long do you wait before the subtle hints become undeniable signs? For me, it was a constant negotiation, a quiet tension that followed me through every planning step, every phone call, and every imagined scenario. I wanted to believe, to trust, to remain optimistic, but deep down, I sensed that something was brewing, a revelation that would soon challenge everything I thought I knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and family bonds. I remember the moment vividly, as if it had been etched into my memory with harsh clarity. We were sitting around the kitchen table, the glow of the late afternoon sun spilling across the counters, when my parents dropped the words that would shatter all the anticipation I had carried for weeks. "Alex, there's no space for you at the Super Bowl this weekend," my father said casually, as if he was sharing a minor inconvenience rather than erasing me from plans I had spent months organizing. My heart skipped. I froze mid-sip of my coffee, staring at him in disbelief. I wanted to laugh, to ask if he was joking, but the stern look on his face told me they were serious. I felt the room tilt, my stomach twisting into knots. Everything I had done, the hours of planning flights, booking accommodations, coordinating tickets, sacrificing personal finances, all of it suddenly seemed meaningless. I wanted to speak, to argue, to demand an explanation, but the words lodged in my throat. I was caught between disbelief and a rising tide of anger that threatened to overwhelm me. How could they casually tell me, after everything, that I wasn't welcome? My mother chimed in, smiling in a way that only made the sting worse. "We just thought it would be easier this way, Alex. Don't take it personally." Her tone was meant to soothe, but it had the opposite effect. Every ounce of effort I had poured into this weekend felt dismissed. I had imagined a joyful family trip, laughter in the stands, shared meals, stories told late into the night. Instead, I was being excised from a memory I had helped create before it even began. The freeze frame of those words, the absolute finality of no space, replays in my mind every time I think about that afternoon. I remember the way my father avoided eye contact, pretending the decision was practical rather than hurtful. I remember the way my mother's hands rested idly on the table, unconcerned about the weight of her words. I remember the silence that followed, heavy and suffocating, as if the room itself had recognized the betrayal. I wanted to ask why, to understand the logic behind this, but I already knew. There was no justification that would make sense. Shock gave way to a whirlwind of emotions. Confusion mingled with anger, heartbreak mixed with disbelief. I felt my chest tighten, each breath shallow and uneven. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the money I had set aside, the time I had spent planning every detail, the personal moments I had postponed to ensure this trip would be perfect for them. It all felt like it had been for nothing. And yet, there they were, smiling casually, as though the announcement was nothing more than a minor scheduling issue. I tried to ground myself, to process what had just happened. I replayed the conversation in my mind, looking for any sign that I had misheard, any hint that this was temporary or negotiable. But the words were unequivocal. No space. Not now, not later, not under any circumstances. My stomach churned. I felt blindsided, humiliated, and disrespected all at once. How could my parents, people I had dedicated so much effort to, dismiss me so completely? In that moment, I also felt a wave of incredulity. Was this really happening? After everything, after all the sacrifices I had made, after the excitement and anticipation I had invested, they were telling me that I didn't matter. I wanted to stand, to scream, to let every ounce of frustration and disappointment escape my body. But I didn't. I held my composure, my mind racing with 1,000 possible reactions, each one more futile than the last. The anger bubbled beneath the surface. It was a hot, relentless force, fueled not only by exclusion but by the casual way they delivered it. There was no apology, no recognition of my investment, no acknowledgement that I had already given so much. The sheer audacity of it cut deeper than words could express. I felt a mixture of rage and incredulity, questioning how people I loved and trusted could so casually erase me from plans I had meticulously arranged. I remember glancing down at the flight confirmations, the tickets, the hotel reservations, all booked in good faith, all arranged with love and care. They were a testament to the effort I had poured into this trip. And yet, in a single sentence, they had rendered all of it irrelevant. The sting of financial loss mingled with emotional betrayal. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the Super Bowl weekend I had envisioned as a celebration of family connection had transformed into a painful lesson about boundaries, appreciation, and the fragility of trust. As I sat there, trying to process, I asked myself quietly, how could this happen? How could the people I devoted so much to treat me with such disregard? I felt a deep, gnawing hurt, not just from being left out, but from the knowledge that my effort and care had been dismissed without a second thought. My sense of value, my respect for myself, and my trust in family all collided in that single, shattering moment. I knew I had a choice. I could let the humiliation swallow me, allow myself to stew in resentment and anger, or I could reclaim some measure of control. I could decide that their casual dismissal would not define my worth. I could confront them, demand acknowledgement, or take action that demonstrated that my contributions mattered. But first, I had to sit with the shock, absorb the reality of their decision, and decide how I wanted to respond, not just for them, but for myself. So I did what anyone in that situation might do. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to relax, and allowed myself a moment of clarity. I realized that this weekend, which I had once imagined as a joyous family gathering, had become a test of boundaries, self-respect, and emotional resilience. The path forward would not be easy. The path forward would require courage, decisiveness, and a willingness to confront the very people I had gone to great lengths to please. And in that moment, I silently vowed that my effort, my investment, and my dignity would not be disregarded. The words "no space for you" would not go unanswered. I would act in a way that made the weight of their exclusion clear, but I would do it on my own terms. I ask you now, reflecting on that unforgettable revelation, how would you react if your family told you you weren't welcome at a long-planned event? Would you sit in disbelief, let the shock paralyze you, or would you find a way to assert your worth and take control of the situation? For me, the choice became clear almost immediately. I could either be invisible, or I could make them recognize the consequences of their words and actions. The night after they told me there was no space for me at the Super Bowl, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city outside my window failing to soothe the whirlwind in my mind. Every detail of the day kept replaying. The casual tone in my father's voice, the way my mother smiled as if delivering bad news about a minor inconvenience rather than erasing me from plans I had labored over for weeks. My chest felt heavy, weighed down by disbelief and a simmering, almost unbearable anger. I thought about the hours I had spent researching flights, coordinating schedules, finding the best accommodations, making sure every detail of the weekend was seamless. I had sacrificed vacations, personal indulgences, and even postponed work opportunities to ensure everything was perfect. And now, in a single sentence, they had negated all of it. The sheer audacity left me paralyzed with a mix of shock and hurt. I reflected on every sacrifice I had made over the past months. The extra shifts I had taken at work, the money I had put aside, the careful balancing of my personal budget, all to make sure this weekend could be more than just a sporting event. I had imagined the three of us together, cheering in the stands, sharing meals, laughing late into the night, making memories that would last a lifetime. I had imagined the smiles, the inside jokes, the photos we would look back on. But they had rewritten the narrative, leaving me out entirely. Lying there, I replayed every interaction from the previous week, wondering if I had missed the signs. The subtle mentions of alternative plans, the vague hints about friends joining them, the casual comments that now seemed deliberate, all of it came together like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see before. I had trusted them, trusted their words, and believed that they would honor the effort I had invested. That trust now felt naive, almost foolish. Anger coursed through me in waves. At first, it was a hot, sharp emotion, making my hands clench and my jaw tighten. Then it morphed into a slow, simmering burn, an ache deep in my chest that was part hurt, part indignation. I thought about the notion of fairness, about how my efforts had been ignored, and about the casual disregard for the emotional and financial investment I had made. It felt like a betrayal not just of plans, but of respect and recognition. I considered crying. I thought about dialing their numbers, letting the frustration spill over in words I might later regret. I imagined myself pleading, explaining, trying to make them understand the weight of what they had done. But as quickly as those impulses arose, I pushed them aside. I realized that crying or begging would give them power over my emotions, reinforce their disregard, and leave me feeling smaller than I already did. I had to find another way, a way that preserved my dignity and communicated the seriousness of their actions without surrendering to their casual dismissal. The silence of my room felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I lay turning the situation over in my mind. I asked myself, over and over, why this had happened. Why would the people I loved and trusted treat me as if my presence and effort didn't matter? The questions spun endlessly, giving me no comfort, only clarity that something had to change. I started to plan in the quiet of the night. Small steps first, reviewing reservations, understanding cancellation policies, weighing options. But alongside the practical planning was a more personal, emotional strategy. I knew that whatever I decided to do had to reflect my boundaries, my self-respect, and my refusal to let them dismiss my contributions without consequence. I would act deliberately, not impulsively, but with intention that could not be ignored. Sleep became a distant notion as I considered every angle. I imagined the disappointment on their faces, the recognition of the effort they had taken for granted, and the lesson they might learn about respect and reciprocity. It was not about revenge in a cruel sense, it was about reclaiming the narrative, asserting that my sacrifices and commitment could not be dismissed casually. Hours passed. The city outside changed from the low hum of evening to the quiet stillness of early morning. I remained awake, plotting, reflecting, and steeling myself for action. The emotional tipping point had arrived, the moment when hurt and disbelief transitioned into purpose. I realized that submission was no longer an option. Acceptance without response would only reinforce the pattern of being undervalued. I had to act. And as I lay there in the dim glow of the streetlights, I made a decision. I would not allow my sacrifices to vanish unnoticed. I would not allow them to treat me as invisible. I would plan a response that was deliberate, thoughtful, and undeniable, a response that would communicate clearly the value of my efforts and the seriousness of dismissing me. By the time the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains, I had resolved my course. I would approach this situation not as a reactive child seeking validation, but as an adult asserting boundaries and respect. The night of reflection and anger had solidified my resolve. I would make them understand, in a way that could not be ignored, that leaving me out after all I had done had consequences, and that my worth could not be erased with a single casual sentence. So I ask you, if you were in my position, lying awake in the darkness, replaying every effort and every moment of trust, would you cry, plead, or plan a calculated response? For me, the answer was clear. I would plan, carefully and deliberately, because some lessons are learned only through the weight of their own consequences. The next morning, I woke with a resolve that had crystallized overnight. The sleepless hours had clarified everything. I could no longer allow myself to be treated as invisible, as though my efforts and sacrifices didn't matter. Every ounce of frustration, disbelief, and simmering anger had coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. I had to act. But the question was how. I didn't want to act impulsively, yet I could not sit idly by while the people I loved casually dismissed me. I began by reviewing all the arrangements I had made: flights, accommodations, tickets. Every reservation, every confirmation email was a reminder of how much I had invested, financially, emotionally, and mentally. The sheer magnitude of my efforts became fuel, igniting the determination that had been brewing quietly in the darkness of the previous night. I could feel the tension in my chest, the tug-of-war between guilt and justified anger. Acting against my parents felt almost unnatural, but the more I weighed the situation, the more I realized that their dismissiveness had left me with no alternative. I picked up my laptop and logged into the airline's portal. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant at first, a surge of hesitation battling with the fire that had ignited inside me. This was not just a financial transaction. This was a statement, a declaration that my presence, my effort, and my value were not to be taken lightly. I knew the cancellation would sting, but I also understood that it would communicate a lesson they had refused to learn through polite reminders and subtle hints. I typed in the flight numbers, checked the passenger details, and began the process of canceling their tickets. Each click of the mouse felt heavy, deliberate, like the measured steps of a plan long in the making. I paused, reflecting on the magnitude of what I was doing. $15,000, countless hours, endless emotional labor, all in a single, intentional action. Guilt surfaced briefly, a whisper telling me I was being harsh, that parents were parents, and mistakes were part of human nature. But it was quickly drowned out by the louder voice of truth. They had knowingly dismissed me, overlooked my sacrifice, and treated my contributions as inconsequential. As the cancellation confirmation began to populate on the screen, I realized this was not merely about flights. It was about boundaries, about respect, about asserting that being disregarded was unacceptable. I composed a message to accompany the cancellation, careful to make it clear yet calm. I did not want to humiliate them publicly, but I wanted the weight of my actions to be understood. I wrote about the effort I had invested, the sleepless nights, the careful planning, the financial sacrifices, and the expectation of inclusion that had been casually ignored. I reminded them that generosity did not erase dignity, and that dismissing my presence had consequences. As I typed, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The act was cathartic, a reclaiming of control over a situation that had made me feel powerless. At the same time, the reality of the financial cost and the emotional impact weighed on me. Could I live with the decision? Could I face the inevitable confrontation when they realized their plans had been undone? My thoughts raced, but beneath the swirl of doubt was a steady, unshakable conviction. I was right to take action, and this was necessary for my own sense of self-worth. I attached copies of itineraries, confirmations, and receipts to ensure that my parents would understand the effort I had expended and the magnitude of the gesture I was making. It was not revenge in a vindictive sense. It was a demonstration of the principle that respect must be mutual, that taking someone's sacrifice for granted carries consequences. I thought about how many times I had been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly hurt, and the cumulative weight of those moments made the decision almost inevitable. Once everything was finalized, I reviewed the cancellation notice one last time. The words were firm but not cruel. I had chosen phrasing that emphasized my feelings, my disappointment, and my decision to reclaim control, rather than shaming them unnecessarily. It was a statement of dignity, a clear signal that my presence, contributions, and boundaries were not negotiable. Even as I pressed submit, a flicker of anxiety coursed through me. How would they react? Would my father argue, my mother plead? Would they finally recognize the value of my efforts, or would they dismiss the action as spiteful? The uncertainty was uncomfortable, but it was a price I was willing to pay to assert my worth. After sending the cancellation, I sat back and exhaled slowly. The tension that had coiled in my chest for days began to ease. The act itself had been cathartic. It was a moment of reclaiming power, of asserting that being dismissed was unacceptable, of demonstrating that generosity and sacrifice did not equate to being taken for granted. I knew the storm of emotions that would follow, but I was ready to face it, armed with the clarity of my own convictions. As I closed my laptop, I reflected on the lessons embedded in this countermove. Sacrifice must be met with respect, and boundaries must be enforced even when it's uncomfortable. I realized that sometimes drastic action is necessary not out of anger alone, but to protect one's dignity and to communicate clearly that being overlooked is not acceptable. I went to bed that night knowing I had made a decision that honored my effort, my values, and my sense of self. The next few days would be tense, possibly confrontational, but I felt a quiet satisfaction in having acted deliberately, thoughtfully, and decisively. My worth was not up for negotiation, and I had ensured that my parents would understand the weight of dismissing me. So I ask you now, could you take drastic action to assert respect after being dismissed? Could you stand your ground even when doing so might risk temporary discomfort, conflict, or financial loss? For me, the answer was yes, because some lessons must be learned the hard way, and self-worth is not something to be taken lightly. The hours after I sent the cancellation notice stretched endlessly. I sat in my apartment, my fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table, my mind a whirlwind of anticipation and reflection. The confirmation email sat on my screen like a quiet monument to my decision. I had acted, taken control, and asserted the boundaries I had been quietly nurturing for weeks. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, I felt the familiar pull of doubt creep in. Would they understand? Would they even see the magnitude of what had been done? My parents had always been loving, but they had also been somewhat oblivious to the quiet, cumulative efforts I had made. All the nights spent juggling finances, all the careful planning, all the sacrifices, they had rarely paused to acknowledge the weight of my contributions. Now, the consequences were undeniable, but I couldn't predict how they would react. I imagined my father's first glance at the email. I pictured his eyebrows knitting together as he read the words, the confirmation of the flights cancelled, the tone of measured firmness I had carefully chosen. Would he be angry at me? Confused? Hurt, perhaps? And my mother, how would she respond? Would she recognize the gravity of having dismissed my presence, or would she blame the inconvenience, brushing aside the principle behind my actions? The anticipation made my chest tighten. It was a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Satisfaction, because I had acted decisively, because I had claimed control over a situation that had left me feeling invisible. Apprehension, because I knew the confrontation was inevitable. I would have to face them, explain my reasoning, and stand firm even as emotions ran high. And moral reflection, always moral reflection, played its part, whispering reminders that while I had the right to enforce boundaries, compassion and understanding would still be necessary to navigate the aftermath. I thought back to the countless times I had gone out of my way for them. The months of saving, adjusting schedules, foregoing personal desires, all of it had been done with the hope of a shared experience, of family unity. And yet, that hope had been quietly dismissed, ignored, or trivialized. The lesson I had delivered was necessary, I told myself. Not cruel, not vindictive, but deliberate, aimed at illuminating the value of respect and recognition. While I waited, I tried to anticipate their reactions. I imagined the phone calls, the text messages, the questions. Some part of me hoped for immediate understanding, a recognition that their neglect had consequences. Another part braced for defensiveness, arguments, perhaps even anger. I knew that their initial reactions would likely be defensive, but I also understood that once the shock wore off, clarity might set in. I also reflected on my own emotions during the wait. There was relief, yes, but it was tempered with vulnerability. Acting decisively didn't erase the pain of feeling overlooked. The sting of betrayal still lingered, the subtle disappointment of realizing that family doesn't always honor the sacrifices we make. Yet, through it all, I clung to a deeper sense of purpose. I had acted out of principle, for the sake of my own dignity, and that gave me a quiet strength. Time passed, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. I found myself pacing, then sitting, then standing again, caught between excitement and anxiety. I imagined them discovering the cancellation at the airport, the moment of sudden realization when the flights they had assumed were secured were no longer theirs. My mind played through countless scenarios, the surprise, the indignation, the apologies, the grudging acknowledgement. I wasn't certain which would come first, but I knew this was a turning point. And yet, even as I anticipated their reaction, I allowed myself to reflect morally. Could this have been handled differently? Could a conversation, a warning, or a plea have sufficed? I recognized that in some situations, patience and dialogue are preferable. But this wasn't a moment for gentle reminders. Their dismissal had persisted despite subtle cues, casual comments, and repeated efforts to engage them. Action was the language they would understand. I thought about my own growth through this process. The act of taking control, of standing firm despite emotional discomfort, was empowering. I realized that waiting, as uncomfortable as it was a necessary part of the journey. Anticipation gave me time to reflect, to prepare for dialogue, and to solidify my understanding that self-respect cannot be postponed. Hours later, the first messages began to arrive. I could see the notifications pop up on my phone, and my pulse quickened. Each incoming text was a reflection of the impact of my action. I read them carefully, noting the tone, the words chosen, and the undercurrent of emotion. There was confusion, yes, but also a hesitant acknowledgement that their decisions had consequences. That acknowledgement, however small, felt like a seed of validation for the countless sacrifices I had made. Through the evening, I continued to reflect on the lesson I had imparted. Waiting had been excruciating, yet it was also instructive. It reminded me that action, when coupled with principle and foresight, can speak louder than words. That standing firm in the face of dismissal can reclaim power that had been quietly eroded. And that family bonds, though precious, must coexist with respect, recognition, and mutual regard. Finally, as the evening wore on, I allowed myself a moment of calm. The initial shock had passed, and I could breathe again. The lesson was not over. The conversations, explanations, and emotional reconciliations would come, but I felt grounded. I had acted with intention, asserted my boundaries, and honored my dignity. So I ask you, when the people you love dismiss you, when the sacrifices you make are taken for granted, would you wait, reflect, and act deliberately? Could you endure the tension of anticipation, trusting that your principles and sense of self are worth the discomfort that may follow? For me, the answer was clear. I would wait, watch, and ensure that the message was understood, because sometimes respect must be earned through experience, not assumed by default. When my parents finally realized what had happened, the tension in the room was immediate and palpable. Their expressions shifted rapidly from confusion to disbelief, and then to anger that radiated off them in waves. I watched both of them, noting the way their brows furrowed, the slight quiver in my mother's lips, and the deep inhale my father took before speaking. I stayed seated, my hands resting on my knees, trying to maintain the calm I had practiced over the past hours. "I don't understand," my father finally said, his voice strained, bordering on incredulity. "Why would you do this? Why would you cancel our flights?" His words were precise, pointed, demanding an explanation that he assumed would come as a concession, an apology, or maybe even tears. But I had nothing to apologize for. I took a slow, deliberate breath, choosing my words carefully. "I did it because I was excluded," I said, my tone even, firm, but without a trace of malice. "I planned this trip, invested my time and money, and trusted that we would all go together. But when you told me there was no space for me, I had to act." Shock flickered across their faces, and I noticed the subtle tightening of their jaws. My mother opened her mouth, hesitated, and then spoke. "Alex, we didn't mean," it's just her words faltered. The casual dismissal, The pattern of small exclusions was suddenly laid bare, undeniable, and I could see the realization slowly creeping into her expression. "You said it yourself," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "You said there was no space for me, and I acted accordingly. I had to set a boundary, because after all the times I gave, after all the planning, after everything I sacrificed, I needed to be seen and acknowledged. Not as an afterthought, but as part of this family." Their responses were a mix of defensiveness and guilt. My father's voice rose slightly. "We didn't think it would hurt you that much. It was supposed to be a fun weekend." "But it wasn't," I said, shaking my head gently. "It was the culmination of all the ways I've been ignored, overlooked, and dismissed. The small comments, the offhand remarks, the times I quietly handled everything while my contributions went unacknowledged. This wasn't just about the flights, it was about respect." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away briefly, as if hiding from the weight of my words. She tried to interrupt, but I continued, not harshly, but firmly, tracing the arc of all the small slights that had accumulated. Every time my effort was minimized, every time you laughed off my input, every time I assumed you would recognize what I was doing without having to ask, that pattern culminated in this weekend. I gave everything for this family and was treated as if my presence didn't matter. I needed to show that my time, my money, and my love are not invisible. There was silence for a long moment. Their eyes searched mine, and I could see the initial shock begin to give way to a dawning awareness. Perhaps for the first time, they realized the quiet erosion of my contributions, the unspoken labor of love that had built a foundation they now took for granted. "I don't know if you fully understand the impact," I said softly, letting my words sink in. "This is about more than missing a weekend. It's about being seen, being respected, and knowing that the sacrifices we make for those we love are valued. It's about realizing that taking someone's generosity for granted has consequences." My father's shoulders slumped slightly, the sharp edge of his earlier indignation dulling. My mother wiped her eyes, and I could sense the shift, subtle but undeniable. They were processing not just the immediate inconvenience, but the emotional weight I had carried for years. I stayed calm throughout, measured and dignified, because the power in this confrontation wasn't in raising my voice or demanding apologies, it was in articulating my truth with clarity and purpose. I wasn't seeking vengeance, I was seeking acknowledgement, and, perhaps, a lesson in empathy. As the minutes passed, I reflected on all the previous dismissals and disrespect. The casual jokes that minimized my contributions, the moments when my efforts were brushed aside, the times I had put aside my own plans for the sake of their comfort, all of it had led to this point. I allowed them to see the pattern, to understand that this wasn't a single act of defiance but the result of accumulated neglect. Eventually, my father spoke again, quieter this time. I didn't realize." "I know," I replied. "And now you do. That's why I acted. Not out of anger alone, but out of necessity. If respect isn't given voluntarily, sometimes it must be enforced by action." Their faces softened, though the tension lingered. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Discussions would follow, feelings would still be raw, and our relationships would require repair. But in that moment, I felt a profound sense of clarity and empowerment. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and refused to let repeated dismissals go unchallenged. As the conversation slowly subsided, I sat back, allowing myself a quiet moment of reflection. Confrontation had been uncomfortable, draining, and emotionally taxing, yet necessary. I had exercised patience, precision, and dignity, ensuring that my voice was heard without descending into chaos. I thought about the lesson I had imparted. Boundaries are essential, even with those we love most. Silence and passive endurance can be mistaken for acceptance, and generosity without acknowledgement can erode one's self-worth. By confronting the situation directly, I had reclaimed both my voice and my sense of agency. I ended the conversation not with anger, but with a calm resolve. I had demonstrated that respect is not optional, that familial bonds are strengthened, not weakened, by honest communication, and that the value of one's contributions must be recognized. After the confrontation, a strange stillness settled over me. The air seemed lighter, as if the weight I had been carrying for weeks, months, even years, had finally shifted. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let out a long breath that I didn't even realize I had been holding. Relief washed over me, slow and steady, mingled with an unmistakable sense of empowerment. For once, I felt that my voice had been heard, my presence acknowledged, and my boundaries respected. It was a curious mix of emotions. Part of me was elated, thrilled that I had finally stood up for myself and forced the people I loved to recognize my worth. Another part of me was reflective, almost somber, as I considered all the moments that had led to this release. I thought about the countless times I had remained silent, the occasions when I had swallowed my discomfort for the sake of peace, the times I had assumed love alone would be enough to ensure respect. Those sacrifices were real, tangible, and yet unacknowledged until I demanded recognition. Sitting there, I allowed myself to feel everything I had been holding back: anger, hurt, disappointment, and even sorrow. I remembered the anticipation I had felt when planning the trip, the flights, the hotel, the excitement of sharing a special experience with my parents. I remember the subtle signs I had ignored, the small dismissals and offhand comments that I had rationalized as inconsequential. And I realized that the cumulative weight of all those moments had shaped my response today. Empowerment came not from the act of canceling the flights alone, but from reclaiming control over my emotional and personal space. For so long, I had given without question, prioritized others' happiness above my own, and assumed that love would protect me from hurt. Today, I understood that love is not a shield against disrespect. Respect must coexist with love, or the bond begins to erode, quietly and invisibly. As I reflected, I also recognized the growth within myself. I had learned to trust my instincts, to value my own contributions, and to assert boundaries even when doing so risked conflict. I understood, perhaps more than ever before, that self-respect is not negotiable. It is not a gift we receive from others. It is something we claim, nurture, and defend. By standing firm, I had reminded myself that my needs, feelings, and efforts are valid and that I am entitled to recognition for the energy I invest in those I care about. The emotional release was profound. Tears came without shame, laughter bubbled up unexpectedly, and I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. It was as though a door had opened inside me, allowing me to step into a space of confidence, clarity, and empowerment. I felt proud of myself, not for the act of confrontation itself, but for the courage it took to do what was necessary, even when it was uncomfortable. I thought about my parents, their reactions, and the lessons they were now forced to confront. It was not about punishment or revenge. It was about demonstrating the consequences of disregarding the feelings and efforts of someone who cares deeply. I hoped they understood, even if partially, that respect cannot be assumed. It must be given, nurtured, and reciprocated. Sitting alone, I allowed myself to process the ripple effect of the confrontation. I remembered past instances when I had felt invisible or dismissed and realized that today marked a turning point. I was no longer willing to let silence be interpreted as consent. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and, most importantly, my sense of self. As the hours passed, I reflected on what this experience had taught me about family dynamics. I acknowledged that relationships are complex, layered, and sometimes messy. Love alone does not guarantee understanding or appreciation. True connection requires mutual respect, empathy, and the willingness to acknowledge one another's contributions. Today, I had enforced that principle in a tangible, undeniable way. I also felt a sense of liberation. The anger and frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks began to dissipate. I realized that empowerment comes not from the act of confrontation alone, but from the inner understanding that we are entitled to stand up for ourselves, that our time and effort have value, and that love without respect is incomplete. In the quiet moments that followed, I allowed myself to imagine a future where boundaries are honored, where communication is honest, and where family interactions are rooted in mutual acknowledgement. I felt stronger, more confident, and ready to engage with my relationships in a healthier, more balanced way. Finally, I smiled at the thought that reclaiming control over my own life and asserting my dignity did not diminish the love I felt for my parents. It simply ensured that my love would be reciprocated with respect, that my efforts would be recognized, and that I would no longer be invisible in my own family. When I look back on everything that happened, I see more than a cancelled flight or a ruined Super Bowl weekend. I see a story about sacrifice, boundaries, and the complicated threads that bind family together. For weeks, I had poured myself into planning. I searched flights, compared prices, made arrangements, and carried the weight of organizing an experience that I thought would bring us closer. I imagined laughter in the stadium, shared meals, and memories we would talk about for years. Instead, what I got was exclusion. The moment my parents told me there was no space for me, I felt a sharp sting that cut deeper than words. It wasn't about the Super Bowl itself. It was about belonging, about respect, about the effort I had made, dismissed as though it meant nothing. I had invested not only my money but also my trust, and that trust was broken with one careless sentence. The night that followed was a turning point. I lay awake, thinking of every sacrifice I had made for family before. The times I rearranged my life to fit their needs, the countless moments I set my own priorities aside. I asked myself why I had allowed it for so long. Why I had assumed that silence was better than speaking up. The answer was clear. I was afraid that by standing up for myself, I would risk losing them. But what I realized is that by staying silent, I was losing myself. Canceling their flight was not easy. It was not done out of spite. It was done as a statement. A reminder that my role in the family is not to be overlooked, dismissed, or erased. As I clicked through the cancellation process, I felt guilt rising, but alongside it came strength. Strength from knowing that respect is not given to those who stay silent, it is earned by those who stand firm. In the days that followed, I thought about how love and respect must walk hand in hand. Love without respect becomes hollow. It becomes one-sided, an imbalance that slowly eats away at trust. My parents may love me, but when they excluded me, they showed that love without respect is incomplete. And that was the hardest truth I had to face. The confrontation was uncomfortable, yes. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and emotions spilled over. But I stayed calm. I reminded myself that my worth was not defined by their acceptance. My dignity was mine to protect. For once, I did not shrink into silence. I did not pretend their actions were acceptable. I stood there as myself, clear, steady, and unapologetic. And afterward came the release. A strange sense of peace filled me, even though everything was not perfectly resolved. I knew I had done what was necessary. I knew I had finally chosen myself, chosen respect, chosen to set a line that could not be crossed again. This experience taught me something that I will carry forever. Boundaries are not walls. They are not punishments. They are safeguards. They protect dignity, preserve relationships, and remind everyone that love requires accountability. Without boundaries, love becomes exploitation. With boundaries, love becomes real, mutual, and balanced. I also learned that asserting yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you whole. It doesn't mean you care less about your family. It means you also care about yourself. And if you don't respect yourself, why should anyone else? When I think back on the journey, my early excitement, the quiet hints of exclusion, the crushing reveal, the sleepless night, and the decisive cancellation, I see a path of growth. I see a version of myself that was tired of being invisible and finally demanded to be seen. I see strength where I once saw fear. Now, I leave you with this question. If the people you love tried to exclude you, would you forgive or teach them a lesson they won't forget? Because at the end of the day, we all must decide what kind of love we accept. I chose love with respect. I chose to remind my family, and myself, that my place is not negotiable. Subscribe now for more stories of family, respect, and standing your ground. Share below. Have you ever had to make a bold move to assert yourself?